Have you ever woken up after a full 8 hours of sleep and still felt exhausted? Not the kind of tired that a cup of coffee fixes, not the kind that disappears after a weekend of rest. This is something deeper, something heavier. It lives in your chest, behind your eyes, somewhere in the space between who you are and who you've been pretending to be. You go through your day. You smile at the right moments. You say I'm fine so many times it starts to feel like a reflex, like breathing, like blinking, automatic, effortless, and yet exhausting. And the strange thing is, from the outside, no one would know. You show up, you perform, you manage. People probably even call you strong, reliable, the one who always has it together, but alone in the quiet of your room. In the 5 seconds before sleep finally takes you, you feel it, this hollowness, this ache that you can't quite name, like you've been running a race no one told you about toward a finish line that keeps moving. You've searched for answers, maybe you've tried sleeping more, eating better, exercise, supplements, and maybe some of it helped a little for a while, but the tiredness always came back. Because it was never about your body. Here's what nobody tells you. The most exhausting thing a human being can do is not physical labor. It's not running marathons or working double shifts. The most exhausting thing you can do is spend your entire life managing how other people feel about you. It's performing a version of yourself that was built not from who you are, but from who you had to become to survive. That's what we're talking about today. The tiredness that lives in your soul. And why, for so many of us, it started long before we were even old enough to understand what was happening. It starts in childhood. It almost always does. Think about this. When you were a child, you had one primary need beyond food and shelter. You needed to feel safe. Not just physically safe, emotionally safe. You needed to know that the people around you could hold your feelings without falling apart, that your sadness wouldn't burden them, that your anger wouldn't destroy the relationship, that your needs, your real, raw, human needs were welcome in the room. But for many of us, that message never came. Maybe it was subtle. A parent who was emotionally unavailable, not cruel, not abusive, just absent in the ways that mattered. A household where tension lived in the walls and you learned to read the room before you could read books. Maybe it was a parent dealing with their own pain, their own depression, their own unhealed wounds, and without meaning to. They turned to you for stability, for calm, for management. Psychologists call this parentification. It's when a child, consciously or not, takes on the emotional role of a caregiver. In everyday life, it looks like a 9-year-old checking on their mother's mood before they share their own. It looks like a child swallowing their fear, because they can sense the adults around them can't handle one more problem. It looks like a small person learning, deep in their nervous system, that their job is to make things easier for everyone else. And here's where it gets interesting and painful. That child doesn't develop a sense of self built around who they actually are. They develop a self built around function, around usefulness, around being what the moment requires. Research published in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry found that children who experience chronic emotional invalidation, where their feelings are consistently dismissed, minimized, or ignored, develop altered affect regulation systems. In simple terms, their brain rewires itself to suppress emotion before it can surface. Not as a choice, as survival. Bessel van der Kolk, one of the most respected trauma researchers in the world and author of The Body Keeps the Score, writes that unprocessed emotional experiences don't disappear. They get stored in the body, in the nervous system, in the way you hold your shoulders when someone raises their voice. The child you were learned to carry that weight quietly. And you've been carrying it ever since. Now you're an adult. And you're still carrying it. But now it's not one parent's anxiety. It's your boss's mood, your partner's unspoken expectations, your friend's fragility, your family's image, the pressure of social media, the constant performance of being a person in the world. No wonder you're tired. Psychologists also call this state hypervigilance, a condition where the nervous system remains in a constant low-level state of alertness, scanning for threat, managing the emotional climate of every room you walk into. Originally, hypervigilance was a survival response. In a chaotic or emotionally unpredictable childhood home, it kept you safe. It helped you anticipate the storm before it arrived. But now, in a life that isn't dangerous, your nervous system doesn't know the difference. It's still scanning, still managing, still braced for impact even when there is none. A study published in Development and Psychopathology found that individuals who developed hypervigilance in childhood showed significantly higher rates of emotional exhaustion in adulthood. Not because their lives were objectively more stressful, but because their nervous systems were working twice as hard to process ordinary interactions. Imagine running with a weight around your ankles that you've been wearing so long, you forgot it was there. That's what this exhaustion is. It's not laziness. It's not weakness. It's a nervous system that never learned how to rest. But here's the truth. This exhaustion doesn't stay neatly contained inside you. It bleeds into everything. In your relationships, you might be the person who gives until there's nothing left. the one who listens for hours but struggles to speak for 5 minutes about what you need. You absorb other people's emotions like a sponge. Their sadness becomes your sadness, their anxiety becomes your anxiety. Their problems become your responsibility. Psychologists call this compassion fatigue, a state of emotional depletion that comes from carrying too much of other people's emotional weight for too long. You might find yourself saying yes when every part of you wants to say no. You might apologize for things that aren't your fault. Not out of politeness, but out of a deep, almost instinctual need to smooth the emotional surface of any interaction. You might feel responsible for how other people feel, as if their discomfort is somehow your failure. And in your most intimate relationships, the ones where you should feel safest, you might notice something quietly heartbreaking. You perform even there. You edit yourself. You present the version of you that is easy to love, easy to be around, easy to keep, not because you're manipulative, but because somewhere along the way, you learned that your full self, the messy, uncertain, needy, complicated self, was too much. In friendships, you might be the stable one, the listener, the one people come to when they're falling apart. You're good at that, you've had a lot of practice. But when was the last time someone asked how you were doing and actually waited for a real answer? When was the last time you let someone hold you the way you hold everyone else? You might feel lonely, even surrounded by people. Not because you lack connection, but because the connection you have is built on a version of you that isn't entirely real. At work, the exhaustion wears a different mask. You might be the high achiever, the one who takes on more than their share, who volunteers before being asked, who stays late not because they love the work, but because being needed feels like the only safe way to justify your presence. Psychologists call this self-presentational pressure, the ongoing effort to manage how others perceive your competence and value. You might tie your worth directly to your productivity. On days when you're unwell, when you rest, when you simply exist without producing anything, there's a quiet shame, a feeling that you're failing. Somehow, that you're falling behind, that your value is conditional. You might struggle to receive a compliment without deflecting. Someone says you did a great job, and before the warmth can land, you're already saying, "Oh, it was nothing," or "I just got lucky." It's not false modesty. It's something deeper, a difficulty believing that you are genuinely worthy of positive attention without earning it, without performing for it, in your relationship with yourself. This tiredness has perhaps its most invisible toll. Think about this for a moment. When did you last do something purely for the joy of it? Not for productivity, not to improve yourself, not to be a better partner, employee, or person, just for the simple, uncomplicated pleasure of being alive. For many people who carry this kind of exhaustion, joy itself becomes suspicious, rest becomes uncomfortable. Stillness feels dangerous, because when the noise stops, when the performing stops, what's left? That's the question your nervous system has been running from your entire life. You might feel a strange numbness during happy moments, a disconnection like you're watching your own life through glass. Psychologists call this depersonalization, and it often emerges as a defense mechanism in people who have learned to be hyperfunctional. The system that processes emotion has been suppressed for so long that positive emotions get muffled along with the painful ones. You wanted to stop feeling the hurt, and somewhere along the way, you accidentally stopped feeling much of anything at all. You might also notice an identity that feels unclear, shifting. When someone asks what you like, what you want, who you are, there's a pause that goes on too long, because you've spent so much time being what others needed, being what the situation required. Being the version of yourself most likely to keep the peace, that the question of who you actually are feels genuinely difficult to answer. Psychologists call this identity diffusion, a lack of a stable, cohesive sense of self, and it doesn't mean you're broken. It means you spent your developmental years building yourself around other people's needs instead of your own. You learned to read every room. You became fluent in other people's emotions. You just never had the same attention turned inward. And now, decades later, you're living a life that might look very full from the outside, relationships, achievements, responsibilities, but feels quietly hollow from the inside, because none of it is fully yours. It was built for an audience. We're halfway through something important here. Stay with me. The heaviness you feel isn't just tiredness, it's grief. It's the grief of a self that was never fully allowed to form, the grief of needs that were never met, the grief of a childhood spent being something other than a child. You might find yourself most exhausted after social interactions, even enjoyable ones, while others are energized by connection. You come home and collapse. Not because you're an introvert necessarily, but because every social interaction required a level of management, monitoring, and performance that most people never even notice they're doing. You noticed everything, you adjusted accordingly, and now you need to recover. This is what the fawn response looks like in adult life. Dr. Pete Walker, a therapist and trauma specialist, described the fawn response as a survival strategy developed in childhood where, rather than fighting, fleeing, or freezing in the face of threat, the child learns to appease, to become so agreeable, so helpful, so easy to be around that the threat never materializes, the fawn response isn't cowardice, it was brilliance. It was the smartest thing a small, powerless person could do, but you're not small and powerless anymore, and the response that saved you then is exhausting you now. Carl Jung wrote something that I keep returning to. He said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." At first, that sounds strange. Shouldn't accepting yourself be easy? Comfortable? But when you sit with it, really sit with it, you begin to understand. For someone who built their entire identity around performance, around management, around being what others needed, the idea of simply being yourself, without the mask, without the function, without the approval is genuinely terrifying. Because what if, stripped of all that usefulness, you're not enough? That's the invisible wound underneath all of this. Not the tiredness itself, but the belief driving it. The belief that your worth is conditional, that love must be earned, that rest must be deserved, that your real unperforming self is somehow insufficient. Jung also spoke about the persona, the mask we present to the world, built from the roles we play, the expectations we absorb, the performances we maintain. He believed that when a person over-identifies with their persona, when the mask becomes more real than the face beneath it, they experience a kind of psychological fragmentation, a splitting, and that fragmentation is exhausting because you're not just living one life, you're constantly translating between the life you're performing and the life you're actually living inside. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived the Nazi concentration camps and wrote Men's Search for Meaning, observed that human beings can endure almost any what if they have a why. But there's another truth buried in his work. Suffering that has no witness, no acknowledgement, no meaning becomes an unbearable weight. You've been carrying pain without witness for a long time. Maybe you didn't even know it was pain. You called it being responsible, being reliable, being strong, and maybe the people around you called it that too, and you believed them because their approval was the closest thing to love you knew how to receive. But here is the invisible truth most people miss. The exhaustion you feel isn't a sign that something is wrong with you. It's a sign that something is working. Your body, your nervous system, your soul, they are all trying to tell you something that your mind has been too busy managing to hear. They're saying, this isn't sustainable. This was never you. You can put it down now. Healing from this kind of exhaustion doesn't look like what most people imagine. It's not a dramatic moment of transformation. It's not a single therapy session where everything clicks. It's quieter than that, slower, and in many ways, stranger, because healing, for someone like you, often begins with doing less, not more. It begins with interrupting the performance even for a moment, sitting in a room and not managing anyone's feelings, not being useful, not being needed, just existing, just breathing. It will feel uncomfortable at first, wrong even. That discomfort is the old system trying to protect you from a threat that no longer exists. Research from Harvard Center on the Developing Child shows that the neural pathways shaped in childhood, even those built around fear and hypervigilance, retain plasticity throughout adult life. In simple terms, the brain that rewired itself to survive can rewire itself to thrive, not easily, not quickly, but genuinely. Healing begins with becoming curious about yourself, not in the way you've been curious about others, monitoring, analyzing, adjusting, but gently curious, quietly curious. What do you actually like? Not what are you good at, not what do people appreciate about you. What do you like? What makes you feel, even briefly, like you're exactly where you're supposed to be? It begins with learning to notice your own feelings before you reach for someone else's, because for so long, other people's emotions have been louder than yours, more urgent, more real, but your feelings are real too. They've just been waiting very patiently for someone to ask. It begins too with grief, and I won't minimize that. There is real grief in recognizing how much of yourself was given away before you were old enough to consent to it. There is grief in understanding that the tiredness you've carried wasn't inevitable, that you deserved more softness, more space, more permission to simply be a person. Let that grief be there. Don't manage it. Don't fold it into something smaller. Let it take up the space it was always meant to take up. You don't have to earn rest. You don't have to perform your way to worthiness. You don't have to carry everyone's emotional world on your shoulders to justify your presence in it. You are allowed to be tired, and you are allowed to stop. Drop a comment below if any part of this landed for you, even just one word. Tell me what resonated. I read every single one. Remember that child learning to read the room? Learning to be small so others could be large. Learning to need nothing so others could have everything. You can finally stop reading the room. You can finally walk into a space and simply be in it, not managing it, not performing for it, not earning your place in it. The tiredness that lives in your soul is not a life sentence. It's a message. And for the first time, you're finally listening.